It happened back in the summer of 2011, right after my freshman year of college. A group of us, my two friends, Liam and Chloe and I, decided to drive out to Utah. We were all into hiking and climbing, but we wanted to try something new, something that felt a little more hardcore. We had heard about Nutty Putty Cave, a famously tight and challenging cave system. The stories about its narrow tunnels and passages were legendary among the caving community. We were young, maybe a little too confident, and figured we could handle it. We'd researched the basic route, watched a few YouTube videos, and packed our gear. Headlamps, extra batteries, water, and some snacks. The entrance was surprisingly small, a tiny hole in the ground that you had to practically army crawl into. The air inside was cold and damp, a stark contrast to the dry desert heat outside. At first, it was exhilarating. We squeezed through a few tight spots, laughing and joking as we went. It was like a real-life video game, a test of our agility. The main passage was wide enough for us to stand, but every so often, we'd have to get down on our hands and knees to navigate a section. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. The only sounds were our breathing and the faint dripping of water somewhere in the darkness. Our goal was to reach a famous section known as the Birth Canal. It was notorious for being one of the tightest squeezes in the entire cave. I remember seeing a diagram of it online. It was a downward sloping tunnel that was barely wider than a person's shoulders, and you had to shimmy your way through it. Liam, being the most athletic of us, was the one who was going to try it. He went first, inching his way into the narrow opening. Chloe and I stayed back a few feet, our headlamps illuminating the dust particles floating in the air. He got about halfway down when he stopped. "Guys," he said, his voice muffled. "I'm stuck." We thought he was joking at first. "Come on, dude, don't mess around," Chloe called out. "No, I'm serious," he replied, and we could hear the strain in his voice. "I can't move. My backpack is wedged against the wall, and I can't get any traction." We quickly moved closer. Liam was completely immobilized, his body wedged in the tunnel with his arms pinned. He tried to wiggle, to push, to pull, but nothing worked. With every small movement, a little bit of rock and dirt shifted, settling around him, making the space even tighter. The claustrophobia was instantly overwhelming. Not for him, but for us watching. We were trapped in a dark, cold hole, and our friend was stuck in an even smaller hole. The air felt thin, and my heart hammered against my ribs. For the next half hour, we tried everything. We pulled on his ankles, but it was useless. It only made him cry out in pain. We tried to clear some of the loose dirt around his shoulders with our hands, but the space was too narrow. Every attempt was a dead end. We were completely helpless. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We were in serious trouble. We had no cell service and nobody knew where we were. Liam's breathing became ragged, and he started to panic. "I can't feel my legs," he gasped. "It's getting tighter." Chloe, who was usually the calmest of us, was on the verge of tears. She managed to keep her voice steady. "Okay, we need to go for help. Two of us can't do anything here. One of us needs to stay with him." I volunteered to stay. I figured I was the least experienced caver and would be the slowest. Chloe and Liam's girlfriend, who had a better sense of direction, were the best options to go back. As they turned and started to crawl back toward the entrance, the silence that followed was deafening. It was just Liam and me, our headlamps creating two weak circles of light in the vast darkness. He was barely visible, just a pair of legs and feet sticking out from the darkness. The hours that followed were a waking nightmare. We talked to keep his spirits up. I told him stories from college, anything to distract him from the crushing reality of his situation. He was getting weaker. His voice was becoming a faint whisper. He told me he was getting sleepy. I knew what that meant. He was starting to go into hypothermia, his body shutting down. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, I saw the flickering of headlamps in the distance. The rescuers had arrived. A team of experienced search and rescue personnel, trained for situations just like this. They brought heavy-duty equipment, but even they struggled. They tried to use a pulley system to pull him out, but the pressure on his body was immense. Every time they pulled, he cried out in agony. They had to stop. The cave was too fragile, and they risked a total collapse. They were there for hours, trying to figure out a way. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and fear. Eventually, a lead rescuer came over to me, his face grim. "There's nothing we can do," he said, his voice soft. "We've tried everything. The rock has him too tight. We can't get him out without risking further collapse." My mind couldn't process his words. It was like he was speaking a foreign language. They were just going to leave him there? Leave him to die? The thought was so horrific, so unthinkable. I started to cry. They told me it was the most humane thing they could do. He wasn't in pain anymore. They explained that they would have to seal the cave, make it his tomb. I remember watching them turn away, their headlamps disappearing into the darkness. I crawled back to the entrance on my own, numb and silent. I didn't cry. I didn't say a word to anyone. The desert sun felt brutal against my skin. The world outside felt wrong, unreal. I kept expecting to see Liam walking out, a little dirty but laughing about the whole ordeal. He never did. They sealed the cave a few days later, a memorial plaque placed over the entrance. To this day, the thought of that tight, dark space, of being completely helpless while my friend was dying just feet away from me, is a terror I can never shake. I can still hear his voice in my head, getting fainter and fainter, until it was nothing but silence. I've always been a bit of an adventurer. My friend Mark was the same. We were both geology majors at the University of Kentucky, and we were obsessed with Mammoth Cave. We'd been on all the official tours, the Frozen Niagara, the Grand Avenue, the historic tour, and we knew the guided routes like the back of our hands. But we wanted more. We wanted to see the parts the public didn't get to see, the true wilderness of the cave system. We heard stories from old park rangers and locals about unmarked passages and old explorers' routes that weren't on any of the official maps. One late spring afternoon, we decided to do it. We joined a standard tour, and when the guide was busy talking about some rock formation, we ducked into a narrow, dark side passage we had scouted out earlier. It was a thrill, a pure adrenaline rush. We were in a part of the cave that felt completely untouched, a world away from the well-lit, paved paths of the guided tours. The air was colder here, and the silence was different, heavier, more absolute. We moved slowly, our headlamps cutting through the pitch black. The passage twisted and turned, and we had to squeeze through a few spots, but it felt amazing. We were real explorers, not just tourists. We must have been walking for an hour, maybe more, when the first thing happened. My headlamp flickered. I tapped it, and the light came back on, but the flicker was a warning. My batteries were fresh, so I didn't think much of it. A few minutes later, Mark's light did the same. We joked about it, blaming the cold, damp air. But then his light went out completely, just like that. His frantic clicking and tapping did nothing. We were plunged into a darkness so thick and so complete, it felt like a physical presence. My headlamp was now the only light in the universe. The beam felt pathetically small, illuminating only a tiny circle of rock in front of us. The silence that followed was terrifying. The usual cave noises, the distant dripping of water, the faint scuttling of tiny insects were gone. It was a vacuum of sound. We stood still for a moment, listening. My heart was pounding, and I could hear my own ragged breathing. And then we heard it. A faint drip, 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 coming from somewhere ahead. It was a simple sound, but in the total silence, it felt alien, unnatural. It wasn't a sound we had heard on our way in. We started to retrace our steps, but panic was starting to set in. The cave walls, which had seemed so distinctive on the way in, now looked identical. Every twist and turn looked the same. The fear of being lost took over. We were disoriented, our sense of direction completely gone. We tried to stay calm, telling ourselves that we just needed to follow the passage back. But as we walked, the silence was broken again. This time it wasn't a drip. It was a scraping sound, like a shoe dragging on the rocky floor. "Did you hear that?" Mark whispered. "Yeah," I replied, my voice shaky. "What was it?" The scraping sound repeated, closer this time, and then a series of footfalls. Slow, deliberate footsteps that didn't match ours. We froze, my headlamp beam shaking. The sound was coming from ahead of us, from the direction we were supposed to be going. It couldn't be a park ranger. They would have called out. It couldn't be another group of spelunkers. We would have seen their lights. The footsteps continued, rhythmic and unnerving. They were getting closer. We had two choices: keep going and face whatever was making that sound, or turn back and risk getting even more lost. We chose the latter. We turned around and started running, scrambling over rocks and through tight squeezes, the beam of my headlamp bouncing wildly. I could hear Mark's panicked breathing behind me, and the sound of the footsteps faded into the distance. We didn't stop until we came to a junction. We didn't remember this junction. My light began to flicker again, more violently this time. The beam was fading, and the world was becoming a terrifying mixture of light and shadow. We were running on borrowed time. We tried to decide which passage to take, but every direction looked the same. The cave felt like it was playing a cruel trick on us, twisting and changing the tunnels to keep us here. The silence was absolute once more, but now it was filled with a new kind of terror, the knowledge that something was out there and we were completely alone. My headlamp gave a final, desperate flicker and then died. The world went black. Not just dark, but a black so complete, so suffocating, that it felt like being buried alive. I couldn't see Mark, couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. We were reduced to our other senses. I could feel the cold rock against my hand, the damp air on my skin. We were standing still, holding on to each other, listening, our hearts hammering in our chests. And then, from somewhere close by, a faint sound, a low, raspy whisper that was so close it could have been right next to my ear. I couldn't make out the words, but the presence of another living thing in that absolute darkness was more terrifying than any monster. We stood there frozen, in the dark, with that sound right beside us. We didn't move. We didn't even breathe. We just waited for the end, whatever it was. It felt like an eternity before we heard anything else. A faint flicker of a headlamp, far down the passage. It was another group of cavers. We screamed, our voices raw with relief and terror, and they came to us. We never found out what made that sound, or what the footsteps were. We were too shaken to ask. We just ran, leaving the darkness and whatever was in it behind us, never to return. This happened a few years ago in West Virginia. My cousin Jess and I were visiting family down there and decided to do some spelunking. We'd heard about Organ Cave, one of the largest cave systems in the United States, and we were excited to explore it. The week before we arrived had been unusually rainy, a series of heavy storms that had turned the normally dry earth into a muddy mess. We called the local ranger station, and they told us that the main tours were still running, but to be aware of the high water levels in the lower passages. We were experienced enough to know the risks, so we packed our gear, wetsuits, ropes, waterproof headlamps, and a first aid kit, and headed out. The cave was beautiful. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and ancient rock. We spent the first hour or so just exploring the upper, drier sections, marveling at the stalactites and stalagmites that glistened in our headlamp beams. The sound of dripping water was constant, a quiet, rhythmic soundtrack to our adventure. We made our way down to a passage known as the River Passage. The ground here was slick with mud, and the air was thick with humidity. The sound of running water was much louder here, a steady rushing noise that echoed off the cave walls. The water was shallow, maybe a few inches deep, but we could see how it would be a problem if the levels rose. We figured we were safe since the rain had stopped a day earlier. We went deeper, and the passage started to narrow. The water was now up to our ankles, and we were walking in a steady, slow current. We were about to turn back when we heard a faint rumble from deep within the cave. It sounded like a train coming from far away. We stopped and looked at each other, a shared feeling of unease settling between us. We didn't like the sound of it. The rumble got louder, and the water around our ankles started to rise, first to our knees, then to our thighs. It was happening incredibly fast. The cave was flash flooding. "Go! Now!" I yelled to Jess. We turned and started to run back, stumbling through the rising current. The rumble became a roar, a deep guttural sound that seemed to shake the very rock walls. A wave of freezing water rushed past us, knocking us off our feet. We lost our footing and were swept away, tumbling through the darkness, our headlamps bouncing crazily against the ceiling and walls. I managed to grab on to a protruding rock, a jagged piece of limestone that tore at my wetsuit. I clung to it for dear life, struggling to pull myself out of the main current. I called out for Jess, my voice barely audible over the roar of the water. When I finally managed to pull myself up onto a ledge, I saw a terrifying sight. The passage we had just come through was now a churning river of black, freezing water. There was a side shaft, a smaller tunnel that branched off the main passage, and the current was pulling Jess toward it. I could see her, her body being dragged by the powerful water, her hand outstretched, desperately trying to grab onto something. She was screaming, but the sound was swallowed by the roar. I had to act fast. I had a rope coiled on my belt. Without a second thought, I tied one end to a sturdy stalagmite and threw the other end toward her. It was a long shot, but it was all I could do. The end of the rope whipped through the air, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought I had missed. But then, I saw her hand close around the rope. I pulled with all my strength, my feet slipping on the slick rock, the rope cutting into my hands. The current was immense, a relentless force pulling against me. I felt like my arms were going to be ripped from their sockets. Slowly, inch by painful inch, I started to pull her in. She was fighting against the current, kicking and pulling herself toward me. The water was so cold, it must have been sapping her strength, but she kept going. The roar of the water was the only sound, a deafening wall of noise that made me feel small and insignificant. Just as she was about to reach the ledge, a particularly strong surge of water hit her. Her grip on the rope slipped, and she was swept away again, back toward the side shaft. "No!" I screamed, a raw, desperate sound. I pulled on the rope with everything I had, a blind, panicked effort. Her hand was now just inches from the mouth of the side shaft, the churning vortex of water pulling her in. I pulled harder, my body screaming in protest. I felt a pop in my shoulder, a jolt of pain that made me gasp, but I didn't let go. I pulled one last time, a massive final heave, and her body shot forward, her headlamp shining a frantic circle on the rock face. I had pulled her back just in time. She was gasping for air, shaking uncontrollably from the cold and the shock. We clung to each other on the ledge, the water raging below us, the roar a constant reminder of how close we had come to disaster. We were completely trapped. There was no way to get back the way we came. We were on a tiny rock island, in the middle of a flooded underground river. We just sat there shivering, our headlamps illuminating the dark, swirling water. We had to wait it out, to hope the water level would recede. We didn't know how long it would take. We didn't know if it would get worse. The silence after the flood waters had passed was almost as terrifying as the flood itself, a quiet filled with the knowledge that we were just one more surge away from being completely swallowed by the darkness. It's a feeling I'll never forget. The cold, the fear, and the absolute helplessness of being trapped underground with the water rising.